I want to say this clearly before I write another word. I am not a hero. I don't think I did anything that any decent person with 2 working hands and a trauma kit wouldn't have done. That's not false modesty. That's just the truth, and I'd rather start with the truth than dress this thing up into something it wasn't. What happened on Vethkara happened because of one reason. She was bleeding, and I knew how to make it stop. Everything else, the politics, the fear, the 300 beings who stood in a circle around her and didn't move, that's just context. That's just the frame around the picture. The picture itself is simple. A living creature was hurting. I walked toward her. That's all. But people keep asking me to write it down, to explain what I was thinking, to put it into words they can file and archive and quote at conferences. So here I am, writing it down. The station smelled like ozone and old metal. That's the first thing I remember about Vethkara. Not the view, though God, the view was something. The observation decks on the upper rings looked out over a nebula called the Ember Veil, all copper and violet and deep burning orange. And on a clear rotation you could see the gas clouds shifting in slow motion like something enormous was breathing underneath them. But the smell hits you before anything else. Ozone, metal, and something underneath both of those, something biological that wasn't quite right, that made the back of your throat feel like you'd been chewing old copper wire. That's what happens when you put 200 different species into an enclosed, pressurized environment and then try to get the atmospheric filters to accommodate everyone simultaneously. The result is a compromise that fully satisfies nobody and mildly irritates everybody, but nobody gets poisoned, so you call it a success. I'd been stationed on Vethkara for 11 weeks at that point. Long enough to know the rhythms of the place. Long enough to have favorites. The noodle vendor near Deck 7's Junction Market. The Pelhari clerk at the medical supply depot who always gave me extra bandage rolls because she found human fingers fascinating. The particular corner of the observation deck where the light hit at 5th hour and turned everything golden for about 4 minutes before the station's rotation moved it away. Long enough also to know exactly which beings to give space to. The Kethvara were at the top of that list. They arrived on Vethkara about 3 weeks after I did. A diplomatic delegation, technically. 4 of them, escorted by a handler from the Galactic Compact who looked like she hadn't slept in 2 standard rotations and was running entirely on stimulant tabs and professional obligation. I saw them come through the main arrival port on Deck 2 and I stopped walking. Just stopped, mid-stride. Nearly got run over by a Moloch cargo lifter. I'd seen images, of course. Everyone who works out here has seen images. But images don't prepare you for the reality of a Kethvara warrior at full height, in full ceremonial guard configuration, moving through a corridor that was built for beings half their size. They are tall the way a cliff face is tall. Not the exaggerated height of something that evolved for it, stretched thin and delicate, but a dense, compressed height. Mass stacked upward, every layer of it muscle and bone, and the kind of quiet physical capability that doesn't need to announce itself because it is already obvious to everything in the vicinity. Their skin, if you call it skin, which is technically imprecise. The Kethvara word for their outer dermal layer translates more accurately as the boundary of the self, is a deep blue-gray, almost like weathered slate, and it shifts subtly with their emotional state. When they're calm, it's still. When they're agitated, there's a faint bioluminescent shimmer that runs just under the surface, like light beneath deep water. Their eyes are amber, not brown with amber tones. Amber, the color of old resin, of trapped light, of something that has been holding on to warmth for a very long time. The 4 warriors who came through that port walked in a formation so precise it looked choreographed. And every other being in that corridor, Moloch, Pelhari, Veth, 3 humans including me, stepped back without quite realizing they were doing it. You didn't decide to give a Kethvara warrior space. Your body decided for you. Some old mammalian circuit in the brainstem that predated language and reasoning fired up, tapped your nervous system on the shoulder, and said politely but firmly, "Move." And you moved. The lead warrior's name was Sharvith Ka. I didn't know that at the time. At the time, I didn't know any of their names. Nobody on the human side of the station's staff knew their names. The compact handler had them listed in the official manifest by serial designation. Kethvara Diplomatic Security Unit 1 through 4, which the Kethvara would have found deeply offensive if they'd known about it, and which they almost certainly did know about. because Kithvara intelligence gathering is comprehensively underestimated by basically everyone who has ever tried to keep information from them. I learned her name 6 days after the incident. She told me herself, in the station's medical bay, in the halting but surprisingly precise galactic common she'd been studying in secret for 2 years. But on the day it happened, the day in question, she was just Unit 1 to everyone except her own people. The lead warrior, the one who stood 3 steps ahead of the others. The one who never once, in the 3 weeks I'd seen her moving around the station, lowered her guard even slightly. The one who had been slowly, quietly, invisibly bleeding to death for at least 72 hours before anyone noticed. I want to explain something about Kithvara biology before I go further, because it matters. Their circulatory system is not like ours. It's not like most species systems, actually. They have 2 separate circulatory networks, one for oxygen distribution, which functions roughly analogously to ours, and one for something the xenobiologists call the secondary pressure system, which does several things simultaneously. It regulates body temperature, manages the bioluminescent response under the skin, and functions as an emergency trauma response mechanism. When a Kithvara is wounded, genuinely wounded, not surface level, that secondary system kicks in and starts diverting pressure to the site of injury. The effect from the outside looks like the wound is closing. The bioluminescence brightens around the area, the skin seems to stiffen and seal. But it's not healing, it's containing. The secondary pressure system is buying time, not solving the problem. And while it's diverting everything to the wound site, other systems start to run low. Temperature regulation wobbles. Cognitive function gets sluggish around the edges. And eventually, if the actual injury isn't addressed, if someone doesn't go in and do real repair work, the secondary system runs out of reserves and the whole thing collapses at once. Not slowly, not with warning. All at once. The Kithvara equivalent of shock is called Vethkala, which translates loosely as the tide going out. It comes fast and it comes final. I knew about the secondary pressure system from the xenobiology primers I'd read during the transit to Vethkara. It had been in the interesting, but probably not immediately relevant, section of the medical briefing, filed between a note about Pelhari dietary restrictions and a warning about the toxic sweat glands of the Malak. Funny how the things you file under, probably not immediately relevant, turn out to be the things you need most. The incident happened on the main commerce concourse of Deck 5. Deck 5 was the social center of Vethkara Station, not by design, but by the natural drift of beings toward warmth and noise and the presence of others. The compact had built it as a neutral trading floor, but it had evolved, the way these things always do, into something messier and more alive. Street vendors alongside official trade stalls. Species who had no diplomatic relationship with each other nonetheless, standing in the same line for the same food vendor because the smell was good, and hunger doesn't care about politics. I was there because I was off rotation. My shift in the medical bay had ended 2 hours before, and I was doing what I usually did with off-rotation time, eating noodles from my favorite vendor, watching the station go about its business, and trying not to think about the fact that I hadn't talked to my sister in 3 weeks and owed her a message. I had a bowl of something that was technically noodles in the same way that a ship is technically a raft, similar principle, dramatically different execution. The vendor, a 4-armed Veth named Koru, made them with a protein broth that I still dream about sometimes. Sweet and savory at the same time, with a depth to it that took a second to arrive after you swallowed, like the flavor was on a slight delay. I was on my second bowl. The Kithvara patrol was doing its standard circuit of the concourse. I'd seen them do it a dozen times, once per standard cycle, Unit 1 leading, the others in precise formation behind her, the crowd parting ahead of them like water before a hull. Most beings watched them pass the way you'd watch a weather event, with attention but without engagement. You observed, you did not interact. I wasn't watching them specifically. I was watching Koru try to explain to a Malak tourist that no, they could not substitute the entire broth for a different broth. And yes, that was a firm position, and no, the quantity of credits offered did not change the firmness of that position. So I wasn't looking when it happened. I heard it. There's a specific sound that a large being makes when something goes wrong inside them. It's not a sound of pain exactly. Pain sounds different. Pain is sharp and present and directed outward. This was different. This was a sound of something giving way, a low, resonant exhalation that wasn't quite a breath and wasn't quite a groan, that came from somewhere deep in the chest and traveled outward in a way that made the air feel different. I heard it and I put down my bowl before I was consciously aware of why. I turned. Sharvith Ka, Unit 1, had stopped walking. She was standing in the center of the concourse, and her posture, which I had only ever seen perfectly controlled, was slightly wrong. Just slightly. The way a building is slightly wrong right before it shifts. The way a sentence is slightly wrong right before the grammar collapses. Her head was down. Not bowed, not the kind of deliberate lowering that means something culturally. But down the way, something heavy goes down, pulled by forces that are overcoming the forces holding it up. The bioluminescence under her skin, the faint shimmer that was always there when the Kethvara were in public, that steady, controlled glow, was doing something I'd never seen it do. It was pulsing, fast and uneven, like a signal with static in it, like something trying to communicate through interference. The three warriors behind her had stopped too. They were standing in formation still, and their faces, stoic, trained, armored against expression, were nonetheless showing something. I couldn't have named it then. Later, after I knew them better, I understood it was a specific kind of Kethvara dread, the dread of watching someone fall without being permitted to catch them. Because that's the thing about Kethvara warrior culture that nobody in the compact briefings thought to mention. Because it seemed like a footnote compared to the military capability assessments and the diplomatic protocol guides. You don't help a Kethvara warrior when they're down. You're not supposed to. The code is old, older than their space travel, older than their contact with other species. It goes back to a time when showing weakness to another warrior could mean death, when anything that looked like assistance could be read as the one assisting establishing dominance over the one being assisted. The code adapted over time, as codes do, but the core of it remained. A Kethvara warrior in difficulty does not accept help from outside their unit, does not ask for it, does not show that they need it. You do not approach. You do not offer. You step back and you look away, and you give them the dignity of handling it themselves. This is why 300 beings on the Deck 5 concourse watched Sharvith Ka slowly begin to go down and did not move. Not because they didn't care. Because the rules said not to. The concourse went quiet in a way that big spaces don't usually go quiet. Not silence, the ventilation kept humming. Someone somewhere had a piece of machinery running. There was still the faint ambient noise of a station that never fully sleeps. But the social sound, the chatter, the bargaining, the ordinary noise of beings going about their business, that stopped. Like when you're in a crowd and everyone around you suddenly sees the same thing, and the sight travels through the crowd in a wave, and the wave is made of breath being held. I saw a Pelhari official, a diplomat, by her sash, put a hand over her mouth and take a step back. I saw a Moloch trader, who was roughly half the height of a Kethvara and who had a reputation for being afraid of nothing, quietly step behind a display stand. I saw the three warriors behind Sharvith Ka shift their stance, adjusting to the possibility of having to stay in formation while their leader fell, because the alternative, closing in, reaching out, touching her, was unthinkable. She was going to hit the deck. You could see it happening. Slow, the way only a very large thing falls slowly, not because it wants to, but because there's so much of it that gravity takes a moment to collect all the pieces. I was already moving before I made the decision to move. This is the thing I can't fully explain when people ask. They want there to have been a moment, a conscious, deliberate, cinematic moment where I weighed the options and chose the brave path. That's a better story. That's the story that makes sense at conferences and in debriefing reports. But that's not what happened. What happened is that my legs were moving before my brain sent the memo. My brain caught up about 4 steps in and offered several very reasonable objections, all of which I noted and proceeded to ignore, because Sharvith Ka's knees were starting to buckle, and the secondary pressure response in her skin was flickering in a way that my xenobiology primers had described specifically as the penultimate stage before Veth Kala. I had my trauma kit on my belt. I always have my trauma kit on my belt. Medic habit, old training. The same instinct that makes you tap your pockets when you leave a room, keys, wallet, phone, except for me it's kit, sidearm, emergency beacon. I was unclipping it as I crossed the concourse. The crowd noticed me moving before I reached her. I heard it, a kind of collective intake, a murmur that moved through the concourse like a small current. The Pelhari official made a sharp sound, something between a gasp and a word I didn't catch. Someone I still don't know who said in galactic common, "The human is going toward her." The three warriors behind Sharvath Khan noticed me. Oh, they noticed me. There is a Kethvara combat posture that the military briefings refer to as threat orientation. It is not subtle. The body opens up, chest, shoulders, and the weight shifts forward onto the balls of the feet, and the amber eyes focus with a quality that I can only describe as the eyes of something that has made calculations you haven't. All three of them locked onto me. And I want to be honest here, I felt it. The threat orientation. I felt it in my chest, in my gut, in the back of my knees. Some ancient part of my nervous system woke up screaming and sent a very clear message that said, "Large predators have noticed you. This is the opposite of what you want." I kept walking. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me then and still surprises me now when I think about it. "I'm a medic," I said, not loud, not performing it for the crowd, just factual, like stating your name when you walk into a room. "She needs immediate intervention. I know what's happening to her. I can help." The three warriors did not move. They did not stand down. But they also, and this is the part that mattered, did not move toward me. 2 seconds, maybe 3. And then Sharvath Ka's body made the decision for all of us. She went down. Not all the way. She caught herself on one knee, the warrior's half-fall, the stubborn refusal to go completely down, the last argument of a body that was losing an argument with physics. One knee on the deck, one hand flat on the floor, head down. Breathing. Just breathing, those huge lungs working hard at the basic job. The bioluminescence under her skin was doing something I had no word for. It looked like the last flickering of a fire that's run out of fuel, fast and small and desperate. I covered the last 8 feet between us in about 2 seconds and dropped to my knees beside her. Up close, she was even more overwhelming than at a distance. Even compromised, even on one knee, she was taller than me in that position. The dermal boundary, the skin, was warm under its faint shimmer, warmer than I expected, and the texture was not like human skin. It was closer to something between leather and bark, but alive, unmistakably alive, and right now running a temperature that my palm scanner clocked at 4 degrees over her species norm. "I'm going to check the injury site," I said, keeping my voice low and even the way I'd learned to speak in trauma situations, not loud, not urgent sounding, because urgency in your voice gets into the patient's nervous system and makes everything worse. "I need you to tell me where it is or let me scan." She didn't answer in words, but she moved her right arm slightly to the side, which, from a Kethvara warrior in Vethkala onset, was the equivalent of handing me the keys to her house. The wound was under her armor. Of course it was, because of course she'd kept fighting, kept doing her job, kept doing her circuit of the concourse with a wound under her armor that had been slowly draining her secondary pressure system for, when I got the full picture, at least 89 hours. The injury was on her left side, between 2 of the articulated plates that made up her ceremonial guard configuration. Something had gone through the gap. The xenobiology report I filed later suggested a high-velocity fragment, possibly debris from a minor hull breach she'd been present at 4 days prior, which she had not reported because reporting it would have meant medical evaluation, which would have meant acknowledging the wound, which warrior code did not permit. The fragment itself was no longer there. Her body had expelled it, or she'd removed it herself. But the damage it had done to the secondary circulation layer was still there, still slowly undermining everything, and the secondary pressure system had been compensating so hard for so long that it had pulled resources from her thermoregulatory capacity, her cognitive edge, and 3 other systems that I was less immediately worried about. I have spent a long time, in the years since, thinking about what she must have felt like for those 89 hours. Walking, doing her job, keeping formation, keeping the expression controlled, the posture right, the glow steady. Knowing, with the precise biological awareness that Kethvara warriors develop through years of training, exactly what was happening inside her and exactly how much runway she had left. And choosing, every hour, to keep going. I don't know if that's strength or stubbornness or some combination that doesn't have a clean human word. I think, honestly, it might be both things at once. The intervention took 23 minutes. I'm going to spare the full technical detail here because I've written it up separately in the Xenomedicine report, and the version I wrote for the Bureau goes into more depth on the procedure than is useful in a personal account. What matters for this story is the texture of it, not the biology. I worked in near silence. The concourse had emptied around us. Or rather, the beings on it had backed up to a perimeter, a rough ring at about 40 feet, close enough to see but far enough to feel like they were maintaining the spirit of the protocol even while clearly violating the letter of it. The 3 warriors had not left. They were positioned at 3 points around us, which I understood later was a protective formation, not guarding against me specifically, but against anyone else approaching, anyone with less obviously medical intent. Watching Sharvith Ka with the particular quality of attention that soldiers who love someone, even if love is not the word they'd use, even if the Kethvara word for it is more complicated and more structural, give to a person they are not allowed to help. That was hard to see, honestly. That was the hardest part of the 23 minutes. Not the technical work. Not the pressure of performing field xenomedicine on a species I'd only studied from books, with equipment calibrated for human biology that I was adapting on the fly for anatomy that was fundamentally different. That was hard, but it was the kind of hard that sharpens you, that gives you something to push against. The hard part was looking up once, halfway through, and seeing the warrior to my left, Unit 3. I later learned her name was Velka Ra, and seeing, on a face that was built for stoneness, the particular expression of someone who loves another person and is watching them be in pain and cannot reach out. I have thought about that expression a lot. It doesn't have a clean translation, but it doesn't need one. Sharvith Ka's bioluminescence steadied around the 4-minute mark. I noticed it peripherally, I was focused on the work, but the change in light registers even when you're not looking for it. The frantic, flickering pulse settled. Didn't go bright, didn't go performance-ready, just steadied, like a voice that has been shaking and finds its floor. That was the secondary pressure system, getting an assist. The repair work I was doing on the circulation layer was giving it something to work with instead of just burning through reserves. She was still on one knee. She hadn't moved, which was partly warrior discipline, and partly the fact that moving would have made the procedure harder, and she clearly understood the procedure needed to happen. At one point, around the 11-minute mark, she made a sound, low, subvocal, not quite pain and not quite not pain, and I said without looking up, "I know," almost through the hard part. And then I was aware of how absurd that was to say, to a Kethvara warrior, who had been carrying this wound for 89 hours without making any sounds at all. "Sorry," I said. "Medic reflex, I say that to patients." There was a pause, and then, very quietly, in galactic common with an accent I had never heard and would never fully be able to describe, something like gravel moving underwater, she said, "Do not stop." It's the first thing she ever said to me. Do not stop. I wrote it in my field notes that night, in the shorthand I use that nobody else can fully read, and I underlined it twice. Not because it was dramatic or poetic, but because of what was underneath it. Not "thank you," not "you may continue," not "I acknowledge your intervention." Do not stop, which is present tense, which is instruction, not permission, which is one warrior recognizing that another warrior is in the middle of something important and does not need acknowledgement, just continuation. That's when I understood that she had, in her own way, already accepted the help. Not capitulated to it, accepted it, recognized its necessity and incorporated it into the mission. The mission being stay alive, continue functioning, get back up. The Kethvara do not bend. But they are not brittle either. There is a difference, and it matters, and I had just seen it from the inside. I did not stop. She was standing again at the 23-minute mark. Not at full height, she compensated slightly for the repair site, which would need proper rest and regeneration time that I told her about and she did not specifically agree to but also didn't argue with. But standing, on both feet, head up. The bioluminescence under her skin was calm. Not warm, not social. Kethvara don't do warm and social the way we do, but steady, present, controlled. The concourse ring of observers had not dispersed. They were still out there at their 40-foot perimeter, a rough collection of species and backgrounds and levels of diplomatic training. all of them having just watched something that none of the protocol guides had covered. Sharvith Ka turned and looked at them. One full rotation, slow, deliberate, taking in the ring. I don't know what she thought. I don't know if she was angry or resigned or processing or something that didn't have a human analog at all. Her expression didn't give it away. It never fully gives it away. Then she turned to me and looked at me for a moment that felt much longer than it was. In Galactic Common, with that accent like gravel underwater, she said, "Your name?" "Adebio," I said. "Yusuf Adebio, Corporal. Human Coalition Medic, 7th Unit." She repeated it, not in my language's pronunciation, in something adjacent to it, her vocal structure reshaping the sounds into something that was her version of my name, which was both less accurate and, I thought, somehow more real. "Yusuf Adebio." "Yeah," I said. A pause. "You will eat," she said. I blinked. What? "You will eat. It is past your standard feeding interval. Your glucose reserves are depleted." She said it like a diagnosis, like something she'd been observing and had simply decided to address. "There is a food station at the intersection of Deck 5 and the central spine. I have assessed the protein content as adequate for your species' needs." I stared at her for a second. "Did you just," I said slowly, "assess my nutritional status?" The amber eyes didn't waver. "You assessed mine," she said. "It is only fair." Still processing. Sat with my assessment report for 2 hours and kept getting distracted. Kept going back over the 23 minutes in my head, not because I'm worried about what I did, the procedure was sound, the outcomes were good, she's stable, but because of the texture of it. The details. The way the concourse went quiet. The way the 3 warriors positioned themselves. The way she said, "Do not stop," and meant something with it that didn't fit into the words themselves. I filed the formal report with the Bureau, which was dry and clinical and covered the medical intervention accurately. I CC'd the compact handler, who responded within 10 minutes with a message that was 3 paragraphs of diplomatic crisis management language and 1 sentence of what I think was genuine relief. Then I went back to Koru's noodle stall. My bowl was still there, gone cold, which in the way of that particular broth actually made it better. The flavors settled and deepened when it cooled. Koru didn't say anything about the 23 minutes. She just refilled the broth and pushed the bowl back toward me. That felt right somehow. The compact handler came to find me around 18th hour. Her name is Administrator Delma Voss, and she is a tiny woman from a station in the Pelhari system who has been doing interspecies diplomacy for 22 years and has a face that has learned to show calm regardless of what's happening underneath. She sat down across from me at Koru's, declined the noodles, and folded her hands on the counter. "The Kethvara delegation is requesting a change to the protocol terms," she said. I looked up. What kind of change? "The lead warrior has submitted a formal request to the compact for the establishment of what she calls a bond of medical trust, with the coalition medic assigned to Vethkara Station." I didn't know what that was. "What does that mean?" Delma Voss looked at me for a moment before answering, and in that moment I got the impression that she was choosing her words carefully, and that the care she was taking was not bureaucratic but genuine. "In Kethvara culture," she said, "a bond of medical trust is established between a healer and a warrior when the healer has, and I'm translating loosely here, seen the interior of the warrior without flinching. It's a fairly ancient concept. It doesn't come up often in interspecies contexts because the Kethvara rarely allow healers of other species close enough for it to apply." "What does it mean practically?" I asked. "It means she considers you a trusted party, which in Kethvara diplomatic terms has significant implications for how the delegation interacts with the coalition going forward." She paused. "It also means more personally that she will answer questions you ask her that she would not answer otherwise, and that she expects, within the bounds of the code, a certain reciprocity of honesty." I thought about this. "She told me to eat," I said. Delma blinked. She did. Right after she stood up, she said I needed to eat because my glucose reserves were depleted. I looked at the bowl. I thought she was just being pragmatic, but maybe she was already. "Practicing the bond, yes," Delma almost smiled. "That would be consistent. I don't know quite how to end this entry." Today, a living being almost died because the rules said no one should approach. And I'm lying here in my bunk thinking about all the other times, all the ones I don't know about, will never know about, when the rules said the same thing and no one broke them. And thinking about the 3 warriors who watched her go down and didn't move, not because they didn't care, but because the code said not to. And thinking about Sharvith Ka spending 89 hours carrying a wound in silence, because the code said not to show it. There's something wrong with a code that isolates the wounded. I understand why it exists. I understand what it was designed to protect. But understanding the history of a thing doesn't make the thing right. She said, "Do not stop," and I didn't. I keep thinking someone has to be willing to cross the floor. Doesn't matter what the rules say, doesn't matter who's watching. If someone is hurting and you know how to help, you cross the floor. That's the whole job, that's all of it. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. They asked me back. That's what I keep coming back to when I try to explain what happened in the 18 days after the incident on Deck 5. Not the politics of it, not the diplomatic significance that Delma Voss kept trying to brief me on, not the xenomedicine implications that Dr. Chandrasekaran flew 4 days to get here to discuss. They asked me back. Specifically, Sharvith Ka sent a formal request, through the compact diplomatic channel, for the human medic Yusuf Adebyo to present himself at the Kethvara delegation quarters on Deck 3 at 6th hour, 2 days after the incident. The request used the official Kethvara term for a bond of medical trust follow-up, which Delma translated for me as something close to. The wound remembers the hands that closed it, and the warrior remembers the person behind the hands. Which was, Delma said, approximately as formal and significant an invitation as the Kethvara issued. Should I go? I asked her. She looked at me like I'd asked whether water was wet. Yes, she said, you should absolutely go. The Kethvara quarters on Deck 3 were not what I expected. I don't know what I expected. Austerity, I think, bare surfaces, functional space, the visual language of people who don't make room for anything that isn't necessary. The military aesthetic. And there was some of that. The furniture was minimal, built for Kethvara frames, which meant everything was at a scale that made me feel like a child who had wandered into the wrong kitchen. The lighting was adjusted down to something dimmer than human standard, and warmer in color, more amber than white. But there were also things I hadn't expected. On the main surface, what I would call a table, what was more accurately a collaborative working space, there were maps. Not digital, not holoprojected, physical maps, printed on material that I couldn't identify, covered in annotations in Kethvara script. Some sections were marked in a different hand than others, which I assumed meant more than one of the warriors contributed. In the corner, one of the secondary warriors, Velka Ra, as I'd later learn, had what appeared to be a maintenance project spread out on a lower surface. Pieces of something mechanical, carefully arranged, a small tool set beside them. She didn't look up when I came in, but I had the strong impression she was aware of every detail of my entrance. And on the wall opposite the entrance, just sitting there, as if it had always been there and wasn't the most disorienting thing in the room, was a piece of what I can only call art. A piece of woven textile, roughly a meter square, in deep blues and blacks and a thread of amber that caught the low light. Abstract, mostly. But in the center of it, a pattern that was clearly figurative, a shape that might have been a wing or a wave or something moving through something else. I stood in front of it for probably 5 seconds too long. "The pattern is called Vethkara," said a voice behind me. I turned. Sharvith Ka was standing in the doorway of the inner room, in a configuration I hadn't seen before, not the ceremonial guard armor of the concourse, but something lighter, more fitted. Still protective, still clearly functional, but less announced. Less about projection, more about movement. She looked different. Not better or worse, different. Like the difference between a person you've seen at work and a person you've seen at home. Same person, same everything, but some layer of external maintenance slightly lowered. "Vethkara," I said, "like the station." "The station is named for the pattern," she said, "not the other way." She crossed to stand beside me, looking at the textile. She was a foot taller than me, and I was aware of the space she occupied without her doing anything to make me aware of it. It was just physics. "What does it mean?" I asked, "the pattern?" A pause, not evasion. She wasn't the kind of being who evades. consideration. The compact translators render it as the boundary between what is known and what is beyond knowing, she said. It is not a precise translation. The Kethvara concept is more specific. It refers to the edge where the self ends and the unknown begins, the place you must cross to become something you were not. I looked at the amber thread, the shape like a wing or a wave. You made this? I asked. Another pause. No, she said. My mother made it. She was not a warrior. We talked for 3 hours that first session. That is, I think, also not what people expect when I describe it. They imagine interrogation, or ceremony, or some formal diplomatic exchange with protocol and positioning and careful language. The bond of medical trust meeting, in their imaginations, looks like a treaty signing. It looked like two people sitting in chairs of very different sizes, drinking something hot. She'd prepared it. A Kethvara drink that tasted like dark tea with the volume turned all the way up, which I found intense and then, about 10 minutes in, started to genuinely enjoy, and talking about things that were sometimes enormous and sometimes very small. She asked about the xenobiology briefings I'd studied. I told her what they covered, and she told me, without editorializing too much, what they got wrong. Some of it was small, slight inaccuracies about the bioluminescence response that gave the impression it was more voluntary than it is. Some of it was significant, a fundamental mischaracterization of the secondary pressure system as a redundant backup, rather than what it actually is, which is the primary mechanism of a kind of biological emergency intelligence that the Kethvara can, with training, influence consciously. You can control it, I asked, the secondary system. Control is the wrong word, she said. Influence, direct, slightly, like she searched for an analogy, something I noticed she did carefully, choosing analogies that would land for a human frame of reference. Like you can influence your breathing. It is mostly automatic, but you can also choose to breathe more slowly. That's why you lasted 89 hours, I said. She looked at me. I am aware, she said, that you know the number. It's in my field notes. I worked backward from the secondary system's depletion level. A moment. 91 hours, she said. I went still, what? The fragment entered at the hull breach incident. Not 89, 91. I was miscounting initially. I recalculated afterward. You recalculated. I had time, she said, and I had the impression for the first time that she was not quite joking, but adjacent to joking. A very Kethvara adjacency to humor that I would come to recognize over the next weeks. You spent 91 hours actively managing a life-threatening injury, I said, and then you recalculated the hours afterward. One likes to be precise. She told me why she didn't report it. I hadn't asked. We were talking about something else, the Kethvara medical training program, which is integrated into warrior training from early childhood and is comprehensive in ways that human military medicine isn't, and she was explaining the distinction between the two primary schools of Kethvara battlefield medicine, and she just said it. The injury on the 4th day, I did not report it because the timing was not right. I waited. We were in a critical phase of the diplomatic discussions. The compact delegation was unsettled. There had been a breakdown in the third language tier of the translation matrix. The human representatives were concerned about the protocol for the secondary trade agreements. She was looking at the textile on the wall, not at me. If I had reported the injury, I would have been removed from the security detail. Velka Ra would have assumed the lead position. She is capable. She is more than capable. But the transition in that moment would have complicated things, given the unsettled climate. So you decided the diplomatic timeline was worth your life, I said. She looked at me then. I decided, she said carefully, that the mission was the priority. That is what I was trained to decide. Does that feel right to you? I asked. Now. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought the question had been too much, too pointed, too human in its assumption that the rightness of the feeling mattered in the calculus. Then she said, my mother made that textile after my father died. He was a negotiator. He was not a warrior. He died in an accident, a transport malfunction, nothing heroic. He was going to a meeting and the transport failed. She said it simply, no performance of grief, no softening, just the fact. He had been aware the transport had a malfunction for 2 days. He had not reported it because the meeting he was traveling to was important and there were no other transports available. I sat with that. That's not the same as what you did, I said, but gently. No, she said, but it is adjacent. We sat in silence for a moment, not uncomfortable silence, the kind of silence that has something in it that you'd rather not fill with words. Does it feel right to me? She said, finally returning to my question. No, not entirely. A pause. It is what I was trained to decide. That is not the same as right. Over the next 2 weeks, I came to the deck 3/4 6 more times. Protocol emerged on its own without either of us designing it. I would come at 6th hour, which was her equivalent of late morning. She would have the hot, dark tea prepared. We would sit. Sometimes the other warriors would be present, sometimes not, and we would talk. Sometimes it was medical. She had specific things she wanted to understand about human physiology, framed as professional interest, but with a depth of attention that suggested something more than professional interest. She was particularly absorbed by the human immune system, which she found both impressive and baffling, impressive in its breadth, baffling in its tendency to occasionally decide that the human body itself was the threat. Your own system attacks you, she said, with a quality of disbelief that was very close to offense. Autoimmune conditions, yeah, I said. It's a known issue. A known issue, she repeated slowly, like she was tasting the phrase and finding it insufficient. We're working on it, I said. For how long have you been working on it? Centuries. She looked at me with the amber eyes that didn't blink quite the way human eyes do and said, Yusuf Adebio. Yes. Your species is extraordinary, she said, and also a disaster. Yeah, I said. That's pretty much us. The afternoon that changed everything was day 14. 11 days after the incident. 4 days before the delegation was due to depart Vethkara and return to the Kethvara home systems. I came at 6th hour. The tea was ready, but the configuration of the room was different. Velka Ra wasn't at her maintenance project. The other 2 warriors weren't in the secondary room. The quarters felt quieter than usual, and the quality of Sharvath Ka's stillness when I came in was different. Not bad different necessarily, but significant different. The others, I asked. I asked them to give us privacy, she said. All right, I said. I sat. She remained standing for a moment, which was unusual. She usually sat immediately, matching the social configuration. Then she sat. I have been given permission, she said, to make a disclosure. I held the tea and waited. The Kethvara diplomatic delegation to Vethkara Station, she said, is not primarily about the secondary trade agreements. Silence. The trade agreements are real, she continued. They are also the public structure. The actual purpose of the delegation is to assess the viability of a new form of interspecies medical exchange, specifically, the establishment of a Kethvara human medical knowledge-sharing protocol. I put the tea down. The Kethvara have been monitoring human xenomedicine developments for 6 standard years, she said. Your species has made, in that time, 4 significant advances in secondary biological system interaction that our own medical corps have not achieved in 300 years of practice. Specifically, and she named them clearly, precisely, the kind of naming that confirmed she had not just been briefed on this, but had studied it herself. Why didn't the compact know? I asked. We did not wish the assessment to be shaped by the knowing, she said. If the compact had been informed, the behaviors of everyone involved would have changed. We wished to observe authentically. I thought about this, and then I walked across the concourse. A pause that I had learned to read as confirmation. The Coalition Medical Corps candidate who crossed the floor when every other being stepped back, she said, who performed competent xenomedical intervention without prior specific training, who established communication with a patient who was not yet willing to communicate, who continued without hesitation when facing 3 threat-oriented warriors. She stopped. This was not what we expected to observe. What did you expect? Hesitation, protocol checking, communication with a superior before intervention, possibly retreat. She paused. What we observed was different. I started. I know what you are going to say, she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite warmth, but was in the vicinity of warmth, close enough to feel it from where I was sitting. You are going to say you just did what any decent person would do. Oh, yeah. You are wrong about the any, she said quietly. That is what I need you to understand. The any is incorrect. We observed every being on that concourse, 347 beings. You were the one who moved. I didn't know what to say to that. The compact will be formally notified next cycle, she said. The medical exchange protocol proposal will be submitted. It will take time, it will take a great deal of time and many meetings and many adjustments. This is how things are done. A pause. But the decision has been made, because of what was observed, because of, she chose her next word with the care I'd come to recognize, because of the crossing of the floor. I sat with that for a long time afterward. Back in my quarters that night, I couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, from a kind of full feeling that doesn't have a simple name. Too many things at once, too many threads. 347 beings, and one moved. I keep coming back to that number. Not with pride, because that's not the right frame for it. With something more like sadness and stubbornness, and an urgent wanting to change it. To make it so that the next time, wherever the next time is, on whatever station or battlefield or street corner it happens, more people move. That's not a medical thought. That's not even a professional thought. That's just something human, I think. The wanting to reduce the number of times a person bleeds alone because the rules said not to approach. She found me one more time before the delegation departed. I was on the observation deck at 5th hour. My usual spot, the corner where the light goes golden for 4 minutes before the rotation moves it. I heard her before I saw her, which sounds impossible for a being that large, but is less impossible than you'd think when you've spent enough time near someone to know the rhythm of their movement. She stood beside me and looked out at the ember veil. We were both quiet for a moment. Your sister, she said. I looked at her. You mentioned her in the early sessions, she said. You said you owed her a message. Yeah, I said. You should send it. I almost laughed, almost. Are you giving me life advice? I am noting, she said very precisely, that the wound of not sending the message appears to be older than 91 hours, and that you appear to be managing it in a way that is familiar. I looked back at the nebula. The light shifted, and for a moment everything was copper and gold. Yeah, I said, yeah, all right. We stood there until the 4th minute ended, and the light changed, and the ember veil went back to violet and ordinary. Then she said, Yusuf Adebio. Yeah. The bond of medical trust does not expire, she said. It does not require proximity. It does not expire with the ending of a posting or a diplomatic delegation. I turned to look at her. In Kethvara culture, she said, the person who has seen the interior of the warrior without flinching is held, in a specific way. There is a word for it. She said the word in Kethvara, 3 syllables, consonant-heavy, with a vowel in the middle that I couldn't quite reproduce, but that sounded like something between shelter and permanence. It does not translate well, but the closest approximation in galactic common is the one who stayed. The nebula shifted, slow and enormous and old. I'll remember that, I said. Yes, she said. You will. I have been asked to provide supplemental testimony regarding the events of the period in question and their diplomatic significance. I will do so, but I want to first note that the formal diplomatic record will cover the significance of the Kethvara medical exchange proposal adequately. What it will not cover, what formal records rarely cover, is what it felt like to watch Corporal Adebio walk across that concourse. I have been in interspecies relations for 22 years. I have seen protocols followed and protocols broken. I have seen first contacts handled beautifully, and I have seen them handled catastrophically, and I have seen everything in between. I have sat in rooms where the tension was dense enough to change the quality of the air, and I have negotiated across species barriers that most people don't know exist, and I have eaten more stimulant tabs than my physician would be comfortable knowing about. I know what the protocols are for, I know what the rules protect, I know why they matter. And I watched a 29-year-old corporal with a trauma kit on his belt and noodle broth on his shirt walk across that concourse and break every relevant protocol for the most human reason in the universe, which is, she needed help and he knew how to give it. And the thing, is that he didn't even know it had changed anything. He wrote it up as a medical intervention and went back to his noodles. 3 days later, I was on a secured communication line to the Compact's chief xenodiplomacy office, explaining that the Kethvara had requested the establishment of an interspecies medical knowledge-sharing protocol, something they had not done with any species in their 4 centuries of spacefaring contact. Because a medic crossed a floor. I've thought about this a lot in the weeks since, about what it means and whether it teaches us something about how first contact and relationship building actually work, versus how we model them in training and briefings. We spend so much time on the formal structures, the protocol handbooks, the language tier matrices, the dietary consideration briefs, and all of that matters, all of it is real. I'm not dismissing it. But the thing that moved the Kethvara, the thing that none of our preparation anticipated, the thing that opened a door 4 centuries of formal diplomacy hadn't managed to open, was someone choosing the living being over the rule. That's it. That's the whole thing. I don't know exactly what to do with that knowledge professionally, but I know I'm carrying it. Packing is mostly done. It doesn't take long. You'd think after 11 weeks a place would accumulate weight, the way places do, the kind of weight that's not made of objects but of habit, of the particular texture of a place at particular times, of the way the light looks at 5th hour on the observation deck, and the taste of Koro's noodles going cold in a bowl while something extraordinary is happening 40 feet away. That kind of weight is hard to pack. It doesn't go into duffel bags. I sent the message to my sister, 12 days ago. She responded in 7 minutes, which is her personal record, and the message was mostly caps lock and some very specific opinions about the fact that I'd taken 3 weeks, and I deserved every word of it. We've been on comms twice since. She's doing well. Her kids are terrible and wonderful, the way kids that age are. She asked me what I'd been up to, and I said, oh, you know, the usual, and she said you're the worst liar in the family, Yusuf, and she's not wrong. I got a message this morning. No header, no formal designation, no sender tag. Just a line of Kethvara script, which my translation unit rendered. The wound is fully healed. The secondary system is at optimal function. I thought you would want to know. And below the script, in Galactic Common, one line that had not been run through a translator, that was written directly in her words, in her voice. The one who stayed is not required to stop staying because they have left. I've been sitting with that for most of the evening. I think about what she said on the observation deck, the bond that doesn't expire with proximity, the word in her language that means something between shelter and permanence. The one who stayed. I think about my father, her father, the negotiator who knew the transport was broken and got on it anyway because the meeting mattered. I think about the code that taught her to carry a wound in silence for 91 hours rather than admit she needed help. I think about Velka Ra at her maintenance project, not looking up, every detail of my entrance registered. I think about the other 2 warriors standing in formation, not moving, not touching, because the rules said not to. I think about 347 beings, and the one who moved. I don't think I'm a hero. I don't think I was brave in any grand sense of the word. I think I was just present, and prepared, and willing. Willing is, I think, the harder part. The training prepares you for the work. The willingness to walk toward the thing when everything in the environment is telling you to step back. That's something you have to decide in the moment, with whatever you've got. I hope I keep deciding it. I hope the next time there's a floor to cross, I cross it. But here's what stays with me most. Not the diplomacy, not the medical exchange protocol that's going to take years to build and will matter enormously when it's done. Not even the moment of the intervention, the 23 minutes, the work. What stays with me is the way she looked at the textile on the wall, her mother's textile, the pattern called Vethkara, the boundary between what is known and what is beyond knowing. The place you must cross to become something you are not. She is, by any measure, one of the most formidable beings I have encountered in 11 weeks on a station full of formidable beings. She is trained and disciplined and capable of things that would make a military briefing officer need to sit down. She is ancient culture and warrior code and bioluminescent warning systems and 91 hours of managed silence. And she has her mother's textile on the wall. And she misses her father, who was not a warrior, who died in a transport accident, who was also trying to do his job. That's the part the galaxy doesn't see. That's the part the briefings don't cover. They are not just their capability, they are not just their code. They are not the threat orientation posture and the amber eyes and the secondary pressure system and the combat classifications. They are beings who make art and miss their parents and have complicated feelings about choices that were both trained and wrong. Same as us. Same as everyone. The ember veil is visible from my porthole right now. Copper and violet and deep burning orange. Something enormous breathing slowly underneath, or so it looks from this far away. Tomorrow I leave. New posting, new station, new corner of the galaxy that will smell like its own particular version of ozone and metal and compromise. But I'll carry Vethkara with me. I'll carry the 4th minute on the observation deck, when the light goes golden. I'll carry the taste of Koru's noodles gone cold in a bowl. I'll carry the sound a large being makes when something gives way inside them, and the decision my legs made before my brain did, and the 23 minutes, and the dark tea, and the word in a language I'm still learning that means something between shelter and permanence. And I'll carry what she said, in galactic common, in her own words, in her voice like gravel moving underwater. The one who stayed is not required to stop staying because they have left.